Hello, this is Mr. Rick Murray, and I'll try not to be too frustrated, but this is my third time trying to do this particular recording, so if it doesn't work this time, I'm 2.5 hours out so far. Hopefully this time third time will be charm. Alright, so I'm not even going to try any music. I tried music at first, and the other two didn't work, so no music this time. We're going to go straight into the organic compound notes, okay? And so, we've talked about inorganic compounds and acids and bases, which can be organic or inorganic. And so now let's talk about things that are organic. All right. A lot of these characteristics are just the opposite or different of organic. So inorganic, organic are just going to be the opposite of that. They are compounds that are produced by living things. So for example, if you find a piece of fat laying on the ground, you know that came from an animal, or a piece of meat that was cooked off an animal, something, because it can't just form by itself. Organic compounds, proteins, fat, things like that, are not just going to pop up. Sugar, carbohydrates, DNA, RNA, those have to come from a living thing. All right, and once again, just the opposite of inorganic. They do contain carbon, whereas all inorganic did not. Okay, so they are all carbon-based. We're talking about carbon-based life forms in Star Trek and so forth, and so that's because all living things on this planet contain carbon. If you burn a piece of paper, it's going to look black. Possibly I'll have the sulfur and sulfuric acid and sugar demo to put up eventually, and you can see that, but right now it's not up yet. So I'm going to try to tape one of those if I can. But anyhow, it just shows that all things are made out of carbon, okay? Now, they are also very more complex carbon, very much more complicated than organic. Organic, you may have 2 or 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 elements put together, maybe 10 or 12, 15 atoms hooked together. Organics, as you can see down here, have many, many elements. And every corner here would have a carbon, and there's also a bunch of hydrogens that they left off to make it easier. All right, so you have 6 carbons here. You have at least 12 hydrogens and probably another 5 or 6 or 4 oxygens altogether. So there's a lot of elements. That's just one, okay? Then these can hook together and make chains. I mean, here's a ring already. It was a long straight chain of carbons, and then it circled around and made a ring. Then the rings can hook together and make long chains. So they're very complicated. A lot of times people say, I don't want those big, fancy, complicated in my food. I want good, healthy, small names. Well, small names and big names have nothing to do with how complicated it is, or how healthy it is. All the chemicals in your body have to be put together by your body, and so they can be organized into much more complicated chemicals than inorganic chemicals. So actually, the compounds in your body, if you had to put a list of ingredients, would be much more complicated and long names and so forth than inorganic compounds. All right. Many of them, like I said, then are polymers. We call them polymers. Poly means many. Mers mean units. So it's many units hooked together. Okay, and here's one with 3, but this could keep on going. Hundreds, even thousands of these rings stuck together. So that's called a polymer chain, and it's made of monomers or single units. Okay, so this is 1 unit, this is 1 unit, and you can hook them together to make 2, or hook another one on and make 3 and 4, and just keep on doing that forever. And so, particularly in carbohydrates, we'll talk about glucose. You can just keep adding and adding and adding more units together. Okay, so they're very complex, and they use a lot of what we call polymers, which are monomers hooked together into long chains and more complicated chemicals. All right. Now, on this page, we're going to start with 4 main types we'll eventually cover, but today we're only going to cover 1, and that is the carbohydrates. Okay, we've probably heard of carbohydrates when you're talking about your eating. Some people go on diets where there are no carbohydrates. And let me just briefly say, anytime you're going on a diet that doesn't have protein, or doesn't have carbohydrates, or doesn't have lipids, that's not healthy. Okay. You need all of them. Now, you can have way too much of them, that's true. And so you may need to cut back on them, but you never want to cut out any particular group. They all have their uses. All right, so we're going to talk about carbohydrates first. From the name, you can see carbo, that means it has carbon in it. Hydrate, I think hydrate means to get water, or you can think of it as hydra, which is hydrogen, and ate on the end of a word like that in a chemical name usually means there's oxygen stuck to it. So it's a carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And if you look at these, now remember the corners are all carbons and there's some more hydrogens coming off. These are made pretty much of all carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Occasionally there might be a few other elements stuck in there, but for the most part, it's these. Now, if you look at the name another way, it's just hydrated, or water and carbon added together, which is what plants do. They take water, hydrate, and they combine it with carbon in the carbon dioxide air that they take in, and they produce glucose, which is what this molecule right here is. And there's another molecule of glucose right there. Okay? So that's what they do. They take carbon from the carbon dioxide and water from the air and use energy, sun's energy, and make glucose out of it, which is a basic building block of a lot of these carbohydrates. All right? First group we want to talk about are monosaccharides. All right? Anytime you see mono on a front of a word, that means single. Okay? For example, if you hear things in stereo, you're hearing it from two different speakers from both sides, or like both earphones. All right? Mono is when it's only one. Okay? And so mono just means one in this case, and saccharide means sweet. Okay? It comes from a Latin word that means sweet. There was an artificial sweetener called saccharin. Same word here. It came from the same word, saccharin or sugar. So it's a sweet compound. So these are basically single or simple sugars. Some of the examples are glucose, which we know plants make, fructose, which is in a lot of your fruit and juices and stuff like that, galactose, which sounds to me like something out of Star Wars or something, the galaxy on the dark side is galactose. But anyhow, it's galactose. And then you have ribose and deoxyribose. You can tell these are similar. They both have ribose in them, but this one says deoxy. Okay? This is the sugar in RNA, hence where the R in RNA comes from. And this is the D from DNA. It has this sugar in it. So all people, no matter how cranky they are on the outside, are sweet at their core because their DNA is sweet and is sugar. It may be hard to believe with some of them, but trust me, it is true. Okay, so your DNA and RNA is made out of sugars. And we'll talk more about those later when we get to that group of organic compounds. But they do have sugars in them. Notice all these sugars end in OSE. If you see a chemical name ending in OSE, maybe not 100%, 99.999 times, it's going to be a sugar or a carbohydrate. All right? All right. Now, if you hook two of these together, say we hook these two together, we could put two of them together and make one compound out of them. And those would be called disaccharides. Di, just like the word bi, can mean two. So these are double sugars. They're two simple sugars hooked together to make a new sugar. All right. For example, in sucrose, which is what we eat on the table, if you have table sugar, that is glucose plus fructose. Okay? All right. Some others are lactose, which you've probably heard of people who are lactose intolerant. That is glucose plus galactose. That we talked about up here, a single sugar. So if you put those two together, you get the lactose, which is sugar in milk. Milk is slightly sweet. It's not real sweet. There's not a lot of sugar, but it does have some. And finally, maltose. Okay, once again, OSE, sugars are ending in OSEs. All right, and that is just two glucoses put together. If we put this glucose and this glucose together and made a double thing, that would be a maltose. Maltose, malt is found in grains, like malt or shakes, those kind of things. Malt balls, like, what are they called? The malt balls, I forget the common name for them now. And the sugar that when you make beer or ale or various drinks like that, they use grains, and the sugar in those grains is maltose. The yeast eats the sugar and produces alcohol, and that's what makes the beer. So all those are important sugars for one way or another. There are many more, but those are the main ones we're going to talk about right here. All right. Now, monosaccharides, disaccharides, these simple and double sugars, small sugars, are used for quick energy. They can be quickly burned. In fact, if they sit around in your cell, they tend to get burned. They can't just sit there and be stored. If you want to hang on to them, you're going to have to store them as something else. You're going to have to dry them or do something to make them keep for longer. These sugars will be used immediately in the body. So they're used for quick energy. It's like, again, a candy bar. It gives you quick energy right away. All right. Now, as you can see down here at the bottom, we have one, and it already has not only two disaccharides, but it actually has three. You could call that a trisaccharide. And it would continue to keep on going over here. It can have as many as you want. If you have more than two, rather than going tri and quad saccharides and stuff like that, or tetrasaccharides, we go to polysaccharides. All right? polysaccharides. As you can see, poly means many again. Saccharide means sweet or sugar. So these are many sugars hooked together. Ironically, they're not sweet anymore. Usually they form things like starch. If you're eating cornstarch straight out of the thing, thinking, oh, it looks kind of like powdered sugar, you will be sadly disappointed because it is not sweet, okay? So generally they're not sweet. They lose the sweetness as they've been hooked together. But you can see how the little hexagon or rings of sugars have been hooked together to make starch, glycogen, and cellulose. These are all polysaccharides. Okay, you can see how many of those different molecules have been hooked together to make these. All right. Now, what are they used for? Why are polysaccharides important? All right. First of all, they're used to store energy. All right. You need to hook together glucoses. If you just have glucoses, they're going to be burned up by the body. They can't be stored. This means that if you went to sleep at night for 8 hours, you might run out of food by the time you woke up and you might die, or have brain damage because you don't have enough sugar for your brain to keep working all night long. So rather than you have to eat glucose all the time, we hook them together in long chains, like amylose. That's one of the main ones. All right. It can sometimes branch. There's another form called this, but for the most part, these are starch, and these are found in plants. Okay. That's what we talk about. If you want a lot of starchy foods, we talk about potatoes. We talk about grains and flour and stuff like that that have a lot, and bread and things that come from flour, because they have a lot of stored energy. In fact, seeds and potatoes, the wheat and stuff we make flour from, that's basically what they are, big storage of energy for the plant when it starts growing. So that's what. Now, that's in plants, it's called starch. In animals, we store it, usually in our liver, in long chains, which branch even more than any of the starches does, okay, which makes it soluble in water and makes it easy to move around in our bodies. But it's called glycogen, okay, and we have glycogen, like I said, in our liver. We store it in case we need extra, stuff like that, okay. So starch and glycogen are similar. They're just glucoses hooked together to store it, okay. This is an animal, this is a plant. All right, now the other thing that happens is cellulose, all right, or using to build cell walls, all right. Organisms that have cell walls, this would be mostly plants, although it also includes some bacteria and fungi, mushrooms and stuff like that. They build cell walls, and to do that, they use glucose. They hook them together, not only in chains, but then they have side ones that hook them together, so it makes a very rigid, very strong structure. And in plants, this cellulose is what makes it have the structure to stand up. Since they have no bones or anything to support them, they need the cellulose to make them be strong and have structure. Trees, example, would have lots of cellulose. Cellulose is not very digestible. In fact, we can't really. But it is important in our food, not as cellulose. If you look on the label, food label, it's not going to tell you how much cellulose it has. It's going to call it fiber. But basically, fiber is the same thing as cellulose, okay? And that's why you can only get it from plants. You can't get it from meat or eggs or things that come from animals, milk, stuff like that, because animals do not have cell walls, and therefore they do not have cellulose, and they do not have fiber. Now, fiber is important because fiber keeps you regular, for one thing. And you get older, some people eat fiber to help flush their system out or if they get constipated. But it also helps prevent getting cancer in the colon and the large intestine and stuff as the food passes through there, okay? So it is important, all right? Now, we're going to see how much time we have here. I'm going to try to squeeze a little bit of this in. We said you need to store sugars. Well, how are you going to do that, okay? Well, to store sugars, we're going to dehydrate them, kind of like the Indians had to do with their meat. They used to dry it out. Why? They didn't have refrigerators or freezers to throw it in, so they had to dry it out. And cells are going to do the same thing, all right? If we look at these two sugars right here, we have an OH group and an OH group here, all right? If we take one of these hydrogens, and this oxygen, that will give us H2O or water, okay? And so we take off the H2O, okay, all right, and we take that one oxygen that's left and we use it to hook the two together, all right. That is called dehydration synthesis because we're taking water away from it, dehydrating it, and synthesizing or hooking them together like that, all right. And so to store sugars, that's what we have to do. We hook them together and form chains that are either starch if it's in a plant, glucose if it's an animal, And that's that.